So basically, the idea of today's session is not more so to teach you how to build a quiz or add questions or create questions, although we might see a little bit of that as we go. The main idea here is to look at the features available and settings available inside of a quiz. So there's a lot of features, strategies, best practices that you can use to increase the academic security of your online exam. However, a lot of those commonly used practices come with some drawbacks and come with some accessibility issues. And basically what we want to do today is make sure that everyone understands exactly what these settings are doing and what kind of, I'll call it the spin-off of activating some of these settings can be, as well as looking at how we can work around those. So if a particular setting does come with some accessibility drawbacks, but you feel it's important in ensuring the academic integrity of your exam, we'll look at some ways maybe you can minimize the accessibility issues. And most importantly, when it comes to that, we're going to look at a new feature that hopefully will be activated before the end of the workday today that will allow you to do just that. So on that note, I'll share my screen. And I do like to share my entire screen when I do these sessions, which means you may see a Skype email pop up or an email, pop up. But I believe it gives you guys a better look at what I'm doing. So I'll go that route, and just let me get my chat open up as well. So if you have any questions as we're going through, feel free to pop your question in the chat. I'll do my best to answer them as I'm going. I may skip over your question if I know it's something I'm going to cover in just a little bit. And of course, we'll have lots of time at the end to look at questions as well. So this is just a sample course we'll look at here. So we're on the course home, and we'll jump right into quizzes. And we're going to start by looking at the concept of a question library. So when you do create your quizzes and your questions, you can just create a new quiz and jump right into adding questions directly through the quiz. So you create new questions while you're in a new quiz screen. There is another option of jumping to the question library, which we see right here on top of our screen. And you can create your questions in there before you start to put together your quiz. And this allows probably the most effective feature of Brightspace quizzes, which is called question pool. So the idea here is that you're creating a library of questions, so very cleverly named, and that you can later pull into separate quizzes. So whether it's a weekly quiz, midterm, final, whatever the case may be, you're going to build up a big library of questions, and then as you go in throughout your semester, throughout the semester and create your quizzes, you're going to draw from the library, and it's just going to be a matter of clicking import from question library and checking off which ones you want to bring in. So as you can see here, it's pretty straightforward. You just say new, select a question type. I'll let you read the types that are there, and you would create your questions here. You can create sections, which creates the folders you saw in the background there. And you can organize them in whatever manner you may want, whether it's based on the chapters in your textbook, the units you're going to cover, or the difficulty level of the question. You can organize them however you want. You can also import questions. So if your publisher provides you with a file of questions, you can import that directly into your course, and then you'll have a large list of questions available to you. I always kind of warn with those where there are question banks, there are also answer banks. So keep that in mind when you use your publisher question bank, that the questions are likely Googleable, as we like to call them. And I mean literally word for word Googleable, find the exact answer, not Google a keyword and read some information. You're actually finding the exact question. And you simply just click upload file, and your publisher knows what file type to give you. It's big money in this type of stuff for them. So you just tell them use Brightspace. They can send you along the proper file. So if you do choose to go that route, again, one workaround to the issue of it being Googleable is you can reword your question. So for example, if I were to open this multiple choice question here that I imported from my publisher, I'd simply just click on it. And now I can use my understanding of the topic to reword this question. So it saves me having to think up an idea for a question, which can often be some of the hardest part, as well as coming up, in the example of multiple choice, my possible answers. So, it saves me a little bit of time, a little bit of effort there. I'm just going to, literally reword this question so that if a student copies and pastes that exact question to Google, they don't find an answer bank. They might find some information about the capital of Canada and figure out what it is, but it's going to, force them to do some reading and maybe accidentally learn the answer while they're doing it. So that can be one way around, the security issue or the integrity issue of using a publisher's test bank. And that's even a good idea even with your own questions. If you've had online quizzes in multiple semesters, always the idea of, or the possibility of a, student saving your questions and pass them on to friends. Maybe you don't want to completely edit the question and lose it. But what you can do is open that question and you can create a copy. So you can just say save and copy. And now I've got a copy of it and I can edit the copy. So then I can have both copies of the question and I can kind of rotate around. Once I start creating my quizzes in future semesters, I can decide which version of it I want to pull in. So again, it gives you the concept and the idea of the question, gives you some of the work is already done. Maybe you've got graphs or figures or equations added there and you just kind of want to reword it, put in different numbers, whatever the case may be, and you get that option quite easily. So the question library is a nice feature that we recommend setting up. It gives you a lot of flexibility going forward and realistically is no additional work. Like you need to create these questions, whether you do it through the quiz or through the library. So we would recommend the library route. So once you have your questions in your library, now you can either say new quiz or start edit an existing quiz. We'll just say new quiz for now. So the very first thing you need to do when you open your quiz, and some of the tips and feedback I'm going to provide you today comes from our interactions with students over the last year. So basically, when you, so we've got some feedback directly from students as well as some other groups at MON have got some feedback from students, and I'm going to try to incorporate that into today's session as I'm going. And so one of the items here, so when I first opened the quiz, the first thing I need to do is give it a name. So I'm just going to call it Winter 2021 Midterm. Oh, I might get in trouble for calling it online. Let's call it remote. And so right now I can save this quiz and it'll sorry, once I go to restrictions and unhide it, it'll show up for our students. So basically what students found confusing is they'd start a new course, they'd go to the syllabus and the syllabus would say, you're going to do weekly quizzes, you're going to do a midterm or a final or whatever the case may be in Brightspace. And when they go to assessments and quizzes, it would be completely empty. Mainly the instructor just, hadn't gotten around to that yet. Everyone was busy. That's certainly understandable. But just by coming in and putting a name and unhiding it, without adding any questions, it just creates a placeholder there in Brightspace so that your students understand where the quizzes are going to be. So you can either do that or just be really detailed in your syllabus that says, the quizzes might not yet be there, but they're going to show up under assessments and quizzes. Don't worry if they're not there yet, they'll be there before you're required to start one. So that was a real cause of stress for students, is that they were confused when their syllabus would tell them one thing, but the information wasn't yet there in their Brightspace course. Because of course you guys should have everything ready 6 months before the course starts. So quick question, can you edit textbook questions and answers? And yes, once you import it into Brightspace, you would edit it just like you saw me edit the question in the library. You just simply click on it, select it, and you get the same option. So once it's imported into Brightspace, it's no different as in you had created it manually or imported it. You have the ability to change and update. And in fact, editing those textbook questions is exactly what I would recommend, because those are the ones that are most likely to be, you know, put on sites by students to allow other students to find them. So there's all kinds of those out there now, and that's the easiest way to kind of avoid students easily finding those. So that's kind of our first tip is get your name in there. Come to restrictions. So basically by default on the restrictions tab here, hide from users is checked. And that's obviously because, you know, we understand that you might not necessarily create your entire quiz on the first go around. Some of these quizzes can take a bit of time to put together. So it's hidden by default, but you can unhide it and then go ahead and put in a start and end date so that students can access it. But if you haven't added any questions, then obviously there's no worries about students accessing it. But if you know when the quiz is going to be, then you can put your start and end dates in right away. So we'll look at the start and end date and what these mean and what some strategies can be around them. But before I get into explaining exactly how those work, I find it's easier to explain if I scroll down a bit first here. And I wish these options were closer together, but the timing of your quiz. So how long are you going to let your students take the quiz? So you can have a recommended time limit, which basically just means their clock ticks down and nothing happens at the end. Most commonly used here is an enforced time limit. And this is a midterm, so we'll use the example of 50 minutes with a 5-minute grace. And what we want to happen after that is the students lose the ability to update the exam. So basically recreating that physical, taking your exam away from you or put your pencils down type of thing. So then we need to change this option down here to prevent students from making further changes. In my opinion, the other two options are not really applicable in many situations. So this is really the main one you want to use here, prevent students from making further changes. So this basically gives our students 55 minutes. They're going to see a timer of 50, and when that 50 minutes expires, it shows up that they now have 5-minute grace. So they don't see an original time as 55 minutes. So it's literally some grace time to go back and tidy up any other questions or anything you had to do. And you can make that as long as you want, but it has to be at least 1. So you can't give 0 minutes grace, and basically that is some time for the students to actually press submit quiz. So even though they can't change any of the answers after the 51 minutes, they can still technically have the quiz open on their computer. So now that we know we've set our exam to 51 minutes, we now want to set a start and end date to our exam. So we want it to start on Wednesday the 24th at 10 a.m. and our end date, same day, and we're going to give them until 1 p.m. So what this actually means is this is the availability of the start quiz button, not the start and end date of our quiz. So whether a student selects start quiz at exactly 10 a.m. or whether a student presses it at 12:59, they get their 51 minutes. So it's literally the availability of the start button, not your start and end of your quiz. So we saw a lot of people in our first go around of remote study kind of do this thing and think they had created an hour-long quiz where students, you know, kind of recreated that in-class midterm setting. That doesn't really necessarily do that. What it does is creates an hour period where your students can start. So what we then saw was instructors making that window smaller and smaller to kind of create a scenario where students were starting closer together and to prevent students from sharing questions or working together or whatever students may do if they can start at different times. So we saw a lot of, you know, half-hour windows, actually some 5-minute windows, things of that nature. And there's a bunch of issues with that and things you should consider before you decide to do that. Sure, it will create a scenario where most of your students start at the same time. It will also create a scenario where a bunch of your students are emailing you because it's 10:06 or 10:07 and you need to come in and manually give them access if you decide to do so. The other issue is that when students have 50 minutes to write an exam, and let's say their internet drops, their browser freezes, their computer freezes, they can restart their computer, they can restart their browser, whatever the case may be, they can re-enter the quiz, and their timer has been ticking down while they're gone, but they still have some remaining time. So if their computer needs to be restarted at the 30-minute mark, they can restart, and they'll probably come back into the quiz at the 25-minute mark. However, that's not possible if this end date has passed. So once the end date is passed, not only can you not start the quiz, you can't re-enter it. So we had a lot of scenarios where students were writing an hour-long exam. They only had 5 minutes to start, and then once it started, a couple of students had to exit, or they accidentally exited, and they couldn't get back in. So there was a lot of issues with that. So it is nice to give it a larger window for that purpose. And basically, you can just tell your students, I can see your start date, and you'll be docked percentages, depending on, when you start. You can set a due date. So if you set a due date here as, so let's say I make this 10 to 11, and I tell my students, I want you to start at 10 and I want you to be done by 11. I can set my due date here as 11 a.m. Should probably make it the same date as well. And then anyone who submits after 11 a.m. is going to be flagged with a red mark saying they submitted past the due date. So you don't need to necessarily go in and look at each one. You can quickly at a glance see who submitted past the end date, and deduct whatever mark you feel is necessary. So it's nicer to do that. Obviously that creates a little bit more work, and that's easy to say if you're teaching 20 students, maybe not so easy if you're teaching 200. But it is a little more convenient way to still get your students to start at the same time, but not necessarily cause a lot of technical issues for them in the long run. And again, a lot of headaches for yourself. So basically, if you had created a really small end time there, and a student emailed you or contacted you and said, oh, I had to exit my quiz and now I can't get back in, you could use this special access feature down here, add users to special access. Field has invalid date range. What do I got done here? Oh, it's due before the end. Yeah, I'm just going to uncheck that for now. And inside the special access here, you could give that individual student a different end time. So you could check off end time, change it to whatever, find that student, press add special access. Now that student can once again re-enter the quiz. But again, if you're teaching a large class, that could be a lot of work if you had a bunch of students who, suddenly needed that right in the middle of your quiz. So we do have a couple of questions, and I'm just going to quickly read them to see if they are related to this. So the first question is, if you allow students to go over time, will you be notified that they did so? So again, if you used a recommended time limit, and said an enforced time limit and said allow students to continue working, it would be flagged as they took more than the allowed time. So you can continue them to allow to go, and there's always a quiz log anyway. So basically you can always see when a particular student started and when they completed, and in fact you can see when they saved each individual quiz, when they navigated through pages. So there is a quiz log of all that stuff that you can always check. And so I noticed there is a question there about the lockdown browser, but I will cover that later in the session. So I am going to skip over that for right now. So that's kind of a look at the quiz timing and the start and end dates, and how to kind of effectively use those. Obviously, it's really going to depend on, I think, the value of your quiz. I think if you're having weekly quizzes with your students that are low stake exams, and they're more, insurance students are keeping up with the work on their own, then giving them a substantial window here to start the quiz is okay. Obviously, for higher stake exams like midterms and finals, you may want to shorten that up a bit for the purposes of ensuring your students all right around the same time and preventing them from working together, sharing questions, etc. But I would have, really warn against creating really small start times, as there are some issues around that. Of course, there are other ways to prevent students from working together, sharing questions. And that was the idea of why I recommended setting up the question library at the beginning. So what that question library allows us to do, and so if we come back to properties, we can click on add edit questions. And so of course, this is how you would go about now actually adding questions, creating questions. So you're going to say you're ready to begin adding, and you'll see here, I'll just quickly look at, you can add those questions the same way we did back in the library. You can do that right through the quiz here. And we'll look at the question pool option. So you can add individual questions, question 1, question 2, question 3, etc. They can be any question types, and each student gets each question. However, you can now use the question pool, and that's because we set up our question library. And in my opinion, this is your greatest tool to battle students sharing questions or working together. And what we do here, so we'll create a multiple choice one. So this title here is just for you. You don't, only you see this, not the students. So you can call this whatever you want so that you know what question pool you have here. And now you're going to browse your question library. So all those questions that we created before we started are now coming into play here. And I'll just open up chapter 1 there. Just for the purposes, I'm just going to grab these 13 questions. And so now, out of these 13 questions, how many do I want each student to get? So I can say I want 3. So each student is going to randomly be assigned 3 of these 13 questions. That means not every student is getting the same questions. And if they have 1 in common, they don't necessarily and likely won't have all 3 in common, especially if we have a larger number here. Obviously, the larger this number gets, the more randomized your quiz is. So you can, basically ensure that students aren't getting the same questions. And there's a couple of different ways you can utilize the question pool. So it can just be simply, I have 13 questions on a particular topic on chapter 1. I want each student to get 3. Press save. Now do the same thing for, so you see now our questions 1 to 3, selecting 3 questions from 13. Now I can go right back, add a question pool. And I can do the same thing for chapter 2. So I could randomly assign a couple of questions from each chapter. And that's a great way to ensure students get a variety of questions. Obviously, there are some drawbacks to that. And that would be that, and I'm sure you all know, no 2 multiple choice questions are the same when it comes to difficulty. So you could end up in a scenario where a student gets 10 really difficult multiple choice, and another student gets 10 really no-brainer, easy, read it and check it off and move on to the next one. So what you can do to avoid that is actually group these by difficulty. So if I were to say multiple choice easy, and again, I'm the only one who sees that, not my students, I can say browse question library, and then I can pick out whatever easy questions, and I say that using air quotes I have. So the easier questions, and group those together. And again, just for this purpose, I'll just select chapter 2 questions. So now I want my students to get 3 of these easy questions. I'll press save. And so if I were to go back now and rename this multiple choice hard, now we kind of are grouping our questions together, and we're ensuring that not only are students getting randomized questions, but they're getting randomized within the same difficulty. So each student is going to get 3 easy questions, 3 medium questions, 3 hard questions, etc. You can also do this in a different way, in the sense of if you had a particular topic that you wanted to test. So, in Rick's example, if he had a particular, concept in physics that he wanted to test his students on, and it was important in chapter 1, he can create 4 or 5 questions that are very similar to that topic and require the same kind of knowledge and conceptual understanding, but they're slightly different. They're worded different. There's different numbers, blah, blah, blah. You might have to take a slightly different approach at the beginning, but as you get into the question, it's similar. And then, again, for the purposes here, I'll just come in and grab some questions. So let's just say Rick has designed 13 questions on one particular topic, and this is more of maybe a long answer question or a question that's going to take a student some time, and just assign one of those questions. And so then you'll put in topic, whatever the case may be. I think I would know some physics topics, but I'm going to not say anything out loud so I don't sound stupid. So there's different ways to leverage that tool. You can use it to just completely randomize how many questions. You could have one question pool. So if you had 100 questions that were applicable for your midterm, you could say, give my students 50 of those 100, and they'll get a randomized set of questions. And you can even put those inside of a section and tell them to randomize the order. And we'll look at that quickly. So when you create a section, and we'll call this our multiple choice section, and you can put in whatever you want here. We'll just be brief. And you can say shuffle questions in this section. So this section creates a lot of flexibility. So again, in the case of a topic, you might create a section here, and you might want to put in some helpful information for that topic. So maybe you're going to include some equations, maybe you're going to include some hints or whatever the case may be. Maybe it's a case study maybe it's a business course and you want to paste an entire case study here. Then you want to press save. And now I'm going to grab my questions and I'm going to drag that into the section. So in this case, we've got a multiple choice section with some helpful information, a case study. And now we've got 13 questions about that case study. And each student is only going to get one. So, if you've got 50 students in your class, obviously only a couple of them are going to get that same question. And the likelihood of those being the 2 students that are trying to work together or whatever the case may be is unlikely. And if you're really set on, make sure everyone has a different question, you could in fact have a question for every student and randomize who gets what. And they could just be really slightly different questions. And maybe would even be enough to know if students shared answers because they took a slightly different approach to the question that clearly states or shows that they were answering a slightly different question. As well here in a different example, if I were to drag my easy questions, and let's call this my hard questions, down into my multiple choice section, and I have shuffling on, now it's going to randomly mix those together. So each student is getting 3 easy questions and 3 hard questions, but they're not going to be in that order. It's not 1, 2, 3 easy, 1, 2, 3 hard. They're just all mixed together. So again, even if some students have some overlap in the questions, they're not necessarily in the same order, and they may not necessarily realize they have the same question. So a lot of the features we look at that cause some difficulties and some headaches for students, mainly being the start times, is all about sharing questions and working together. And obviously there's some more work in here because you need to create more questions or more versions of your questions. But you can accomplish the randomization here this way instead of really trying to limit your students' access. So Sherry asked if it creates a different answer key for the randomized sequence of questions. So unfortunately, Brightspace won't really spit out an answer key that you can kind of, print or share. But what it does is, for questions that have defined answers, so like your multiple choice, your fill-ins, multiple choice, multi-select, short answer, basically everything other than written response has a defined answer, and it knows what the answer to each question is. So if student A gets question 1, then it applies the answer that you gave for question 1. And if student B gets question 6, then it applies the answer that's applicable to question 6. So when each student goes in and looks at their quiz afterwards, the answers are applied to their quiz only. And not necessarily all the questions. So when the quiz is over, and if you've allowed students to go back and look at their answers, and the correct solution, then they would only see their exact quiz. So if you wanted students to see every question, you could create kind of a study quiz at the end of the semester, and you could remove the randomization. You could just create a quiz and put every question in it and allow students to take it, maybe before the final, whatever the case may be. But yeah, by default, they don't see the other questions that were an option. They just see what was assigned to them and what answer was applicable to that question. So I think the question pool is probably the most important tool when it comes to your academic integrity. Obviously, there's only so much you can control on the other end, what students are doing here on their own. But creating good, thought-provoking questions that aren't necessarily easily Googleable, and then providing some randomization is going to be your best way. So if I can't easily Google a question, and if I can't easily ask my friend what they did for theirs, well, there are still other ways to cheat. You know what I mean? I can still Google keywords. I can still take out my textbook and go through it. And it does kind of make it a little bit more like an assignment, more so than a quiz. It does kind of force your students to do some reading and some learning, and their objectives or your objective of them learning a particular topic, is probably going to be satisfied. Maybe not necessarily in the way you had hoped, but again, students have a limited amount of time, so it's not going to be possible for them to sit here and look up keywords or go through their notes and their textbook for every question. So you are still creating that quiz environment when students can't Google the exact answer and they can't ask their friends because they don't have the same questions. So those the question pool and how you utilize it, I think is very important. There's many different ways, like I said, whether it's randomizing the entire quiz from one major question pool, whether it's narrowing it down to different difficulty levels, and you can break that down into many as you want. I've seen some instructors who had 5 difficulty levels of questions and assign them in that nature. Or you can really go topics and just assign one of that question pool. And I think that is a good way for subjects that have, more longer answer questions where students are actually going to, spend 10 or 15 minutes maybe doing some workings on their own and then put in an answer. Providing some randomization there can be a nice way to do that. So Rebecca mentions that she's had some students who got short answer questions wrong because they misspelled or put in a different order. So need for me to read through every answer for correct grading. So short answer questions I can be confusing on what they mean. Like when you look at a glance at short and written response, short answer almost makes it seem like what you're expecting from the student. But in fact, short answer requires an exact answer from the student. I know for me personally, I would likely get every question wrong, as I've even spelled my name wrong on quizzes, spelling not my strong point. So I would have a lot of difficulty with these types of questions. So there are a couple of options here. You can add more than one answer. So if there are commonly misspelled or misspellings of a word, or there's more than one word that means the same thing, you can add multiple correct answers. And if a student adds any of those, if student answers with multiple ways, they can get it right. But you can also add what's called regular expression, which means you'll see here this variable. I used to know what that was called, but this basically creates a wildcard. So like oftentimes you can. So if the answer was cat and I had it like this, that means that can either be blank or a student can say cats. So they can add an S and the system will read it right because this is a wildcard feature form. But basically, I wouldn't use short answer questions, unless you are confident that every student is going to write exactly word for word what you're expecting. And anything outside of that, I would use a written response question. And you can kind of set the expectation of what you're looking for here by saying, I want a bit shorter. So you see it changes the size of the text box over here on the right in our preview. So you can, kind of set the expectations a little bit, and you can even give it, put a note in here that says, 1 or 2 word max answer, or whatever the case may be. And then that forces you to kind of manually grade those. Or Rebecca, you can just kind of do as you're doing and let the system auto grade some of them for you, and you just quickly glance down through the ones that got it wrong to see if their answer was actually correct or acceptable, and then you can manually change it. So anything that's auto graded can be manually changed on a student's individual paper. So if you go through each paper, you can quickly apply marks to any question for a given student. But realistically, the short answer is a very specific use case. And like you said, it can be difficult for students to get that exactly right. So any questions on the question pool? So again, as I mentioned, I think the question pool is probably your most important tool. So I do just want to check, see if everyone. And so while we're discussing questions and actually looking at the layout of our quiz, one thing that came up from our feedback with students was that oftentimes they had some difficulties. Circumflex, yeah. So Rebecca asked if there's a way to import a Word file of multiple choice questions. So there is an intermediate tool between Brightspace and your Word file that will allow you to do that, called Respondus Quiz Editor, I think, called Respondus. Depending on how many multiple choice questions you have, I would say it might be easier to copy and paste. The format you need to put them in is very specific. And editing your Word file to match the specific details you need. So you need to label each one as multiple choice. You need to label it what it's worth. The question needs to be in a certain format. The answers need to be in a certain format. You honestly may find it quicker to just open up a new question, copy paste, save and new, copy paste, save and new, copy paste. You may get through it quicker, to be honest, but I can certainly share the resources along the Respondus tool towards the end of the session, and you can have a look at it, and we can certainly have someone from our support center look at it with you and help you set that up. But in my experience, if you don't have hundreds of questions, or you don't plan on doing this, if you plan on doing this every semester and you think it's going to be a useful tool to learn how to use, the copy and paste feature might be easier. The other thing about our question pools, that I will note, is that you can go into your question pool and you'll see all the questions, and you can actually edit an individual question by clicking on it. I can edit the question, I can edit the answers, whatever the case may be. So as I was saying, the other thing when it comes to adding questions and some feedback we got from students is that, oftentimes things came up as they were writing their exam, everything from they lost their internet connection to their barber scan started running, their computer was going really slow. They had to use the washroom, they had whatever the case may be. They didn't understand what you were asking on a particular question, so they, just took a stab at it. But the bottom line was a lot of students wanted the ability to kind of, give some explanation for how they performed on the quiz. And the quiz doesn't really necessarily allow you to do that. So what we've recommended is that your final question be a written response question that's just called student feedback, and it's just a place for your students to. So it's not worth any marks. Or maybe if you want feedback on the quiz, if you really want to hear what students thought of the quiz, whether it was too hard, too easy, whatever the case may be. Well, I don't think you'll get too many students telling you it was too easy, but you can assign a mark or something if you really want. But just create a written response question at the end. Student feedback, any difficulties you experience during the exam. It'll probably save you from receiving 40 email if you have a big course. And if a student underperformed from what you expected, or if you plan on reviewing each quiz anyway, you can kind of have a look at that and just see if there's anything that may either change your mind on how you grade a particular student or how you grade a particular question. Maybe you have multiple students that say, oh, I found question 4 to be difficult. I don't think we covered that topic yet. And you might realize you never. Or maybe, there's a question that you didn't have the right answer for, or the right answer wasn't in there for a multiple choice question, in students. So if you have a 50 multiple choice quiz, there's really nowhere for a student to type anything in. So if there was a particular question where they thought the right answer wasn't there, there's really no way for them to tell you that. So if you have that option at the end with a feedback question, they can type that out there and get that through to you. And you might find that a little more organized than receiving a bunch of email. So that's a look at questions and question pools. So when we come back here to our main quiz page here, there was a couple of other settings that we've seen used a lot in the last little bit. The main one being the question paging here. So what you can do is decide how many questions you want per page, 1, 2, 3, 10, or you can have them all on one page, whatever the case may be. And so you simply just type in how many questions you want and press apply. And it shows you here then what the breakdown looks like. So you can scroll down through. Obviously, if you had a lot of questions here, it would look a little nicer. And you'll see, right? So it tells us you got a multiple choice section with 3 questions. And here's how it's going to look. The other popular thing was to then turn on prevent from moving back. So there are some academic integrity arguments for turning this feature on. Basically prevents students from, getting through their quiz as quick as they can with all the questions they know, and then going back and deciding which ones they want to research. Not necessarily a great approach. Basically, this feature has caused significant stress on students, and it's probably the biggest complaint we've received about online quizzes in the last year. So we've heard from students more on this feature than we have about timing. Like, obviously you get some complaints, oh, I never had enough time, my prof didn't give me enough time, etc. But this feature here has created the most anxiety for our students. And I know, looking back at how I took exams and how my simple brain worked, you would read a question at the start of an exam and you may not know how to do it. But then as you went on through the exam and you read about other questions and you remembered that stuff, it kind of brought back the memories of other questions. And I would flip back and know the answer to that question right away. And so you prevent students from doing that. And students just have different strategies in taking quizzes. Some students like to go back, like to fly through it, like I said, and answer everything they know off the top of their head. And then they go back and go through the questions that they didn't necessarily know upon first reading. And that doesn't mean they're cheating while they're doing that. It just means they want to sit back and think about that and use whatever time they have left. And so by turning on this feature, you are you are preventing students from doing that. Again, it's up to yourself what you feel is most applicable here, what's more important, preventing them from going back or for academic integrity reasons, or allowing them that ability to go back and review and maybe change some answers. So I'm not necessarily recommending one way or the other. I'm basically just presenting both sides, that there is a drawback to using that. And it's not as simple as, oh, I just don't let them go back and see the questions. If it is really important to you, or you feel like it's helpful, I would suggest that you are really upfront with your students about it. It does give them a note when they open the quiz. It's kind of vague. In fact, what I would recommend is that at the bottom here, you have the option to put page header and footer. And on the page footer, you could type out, if you will not be able to return to this page. So kind of a last ditch warning. Every time they click next page, they get a little warning on the bottom of the page that warns them that if they click next, they can't come back. So make sure you review this, because we had an unbelievable amount of instances where students didn't realize that, and they went through their exam skipping questions the whole way, expecting to go back, because when they took an exam that same day in another course, they were able to do that, and they didn't notice the little note on the quiz page that said they couldn't go back. And students had left out 50% of their exam just because of their strategy on how they take exams. So if it is really important to you, we do stress that your students know up front, and just go ahead and say, cannot come back to this page. And there's probably a better wording. You can make that bold and make that red. So now at the bottom of every page, this warning is going to show up. So as well here, you can create a page header. There's a number of things you can do here with this, whether it's helpful information for your students, whether it's a simple good luck, or whether it's a reminder about cheating. So these options here, you see there's a description and an introduction. So they show up on the cover page. So if you picture a paper-based exam and you have your cover page, those notes are going to show up there, and that's a great place to put an academic integrity statement and just reminding students of the importance of writing their own exam, writing it honestly. You can either take the fair route and remind them what happens if you're caught cheating, or you can take the route of if this is a first or second year course, you're going to need to know this stuff in future courses. So taking your quiz dishonestly is eventually going to catch up on you. So this can be your place where you can put that kind of statement. I have seen some instructors actually do it as a question, a true and false question, or a multiple choice question with yes or no. Making students actually acknowledge that they're not going to cheat. Realistically, at the end of the day, if a student cheats, they violated university policies, and whether they said yes or no to a question is semi-irrelevant. But if you want to do the question as well, that might create a little more fear in your students, let's call it. So scrolling down here to the bottom below our page footer and header, we have some other options that we'll look at. So you can allow hints. So whether you created your question yourself or whether you imported it from your from a test bank, you can likely have hints in there. So you can add hints to your questions as you're creating them. But if you don't allow them on a particular quiz, they don't show up. So if every question in your question library has a hint and you don't check it off on that particular exam, it doesn't show up. And why you may do that is you may have, some weekly quizzes or some midterms or whatever you want to call them throughout the semester, and you don't want your students to have hints because they're part of the evaluation. But before their final exam, you're going to create a review quiz, and you're going to add, all the questions they had throughout the semester, or all the questions that they could have got based on the randomization. And now you're going to turn on hints, because this is not worth anything. It's really just for students to practice and study. So you can kind of take advantage of the hints tool when you want and when you don't want. Next, we have disable right click. Obviously, the purpose of this option is to prevent students from copying and pasting. And if you're using Chrome like I am, you'll see it's super easy. I can just highlight some text and I can search Google for that particular text in one click. If I right click, I don't even need to copy and paste. Chrome just gives me the option to search it. So disabling the right click prevents that. However, there are keyboard shortcuts. So if your students know how to copy and paste with the keyboard, they can still do that. It doesn't prevent that. And what this does prevent is students who are using screen readers that involve the right click. So some screen readers or some accessibility tools require a student to right click on a part of a page and say read this, or right click and say what's this, whatever the case may be, and it gives them the information or it reads the question out for them. So if they can't right click, they can't use that tool. So if you want to use this disable right click, you should make sure your students know this up front, and they should let you know if they need that feature for accessibility reasons. And if you want, you can require them to go to the Blundin Center and have the Blundin approve that that accommodation. And I'm going to show you shortly how you can allow those students who need it to be able to do it while preventing the rest of the class. And that's a new feature coming later today. And I'll show you how to do that in just a few minutes when we look at accommodations. And then the bottom option here, it's nice to check off disable instant messenger and alerts. So basically it disables Brightspace course mail and the Brightspace instant messenger to prevent your students from contacting each other via Brightspace. So if they have another method to contact each other, unfortunately we can't stop that, but it does at least prevent them from just randomly going to the class list, clicking on a student's name or a bunch of students' names and emailing them and asking them a question, which we've seen in the past. So this is a good one to turn on. There's really no downside to this one other than the fact that it doesn't completely prevent them from contacting each other. So just a few other things that have come up, and I know we're getting close to the end here, so I'll try to go up quickly so that we can take some questions. But the other big thing that came up from student feedback is the lack of ability to ask your instructor a question. So if you picture, your standard midterm or final, you are physically in the room with your students. And if a student doesn't quite understand the question, they would put up their hand and ask for a little help, and you can decide what help you want to give them. That's kind of eliminated when a student is just at home in their bedroom writing a quiz. So what we recommend is that either that you set up an understanding on how your students can contact you during the exam, whether it's email and you're telling them, okay, I'm going to sit there for the time frame, whether it's an hour, and check my email. Whether you have a TA assigned to that, and you're going to tell them to email the TA. Or, if possible, you can set up a WebEx session or an online room session and have that live during your quiz. So if you've got just an hour window or whatever the case may be, it might be possible for you to be available for that hour. And that can be another way that you can encourage students to write within that set hour that you wanted them. So you've set your time frame 10 to 11. I'm going to be available from 10 to 11. If you have any issues, if you start at 10, if you have any issues, you can restart your quiz, you can get back in. If you have any issues, you can log into WebEx and I'll be there. You're not necessarily going to force them to log into WebEx and sit there, but you're available for them if they have questions. So it's a good way to encourage students to start the exam on time. It's because you're making yourself really easily available to them if they have questions. And so I know as a student, if I decide to wait until 10 to 11 to start my quiz, well, not only am I going to get into trouble if I have to restart my computer, but I also don't have easy access to my instructor if I have a question or a concern during the exam. So that's one way. Obviously, I've seen some instructors provide their telephone numbers and make themselves available that way. Obviously, you can only speak to one student at a time there. Whereas in a WebEx or online room session, you can have multiple students sign in and kind of, they'll understand you're already helping one student and move on to the next. And the last thing I wanted to discuss is we had a question earlier about the lockdown browser, or I don't know if it was so much of a question, but more so of a comment. And the lockdown browser has a use and has a purpose. So the idea of the lockdown browser is students download and launch a different browser than what they typically use. So they don't use Chrome, they don't use Firefox, they use the lockdown browser. There's no URL, there's no back button, they basically just they navigate, log into the quiz, and now that's all they can basically do. So in theory, that sounds great. Prevents them from, Googling other options, prevents them from opening up the notes, whatever the case may be. But that is in a perfect world where they have no other connected devices in their house, which I highly doubt there are many students who fit that category. So basically, the Respondus lockdown browser is great for lab environments or a scenario where you are physically watching your students and they can't take out their phone or they can't take out their tablet. It's great for preventing that they open up a new tab, Google something while you're, up at the front of the classroom taking a sip of your coffee. It'll prevent that. But if you're going to use it for students who are at home writing, you are going to cause some accessibility issues. Not all screen readers are compatible with it. Obviously, it prevents the right click, and we can't override that for individual students. So, anyone who needs that right click to read their exam is going to be harmed. And at the end of the day, you're not providing much more security. Like, again, if you're not physically watching your students, it's not really any more secure. And in anything, you're just causing difficulty. So for example, if a student has a connectivity issue, they can't open their connections and try to reestablish a connection because the lockdown browser doesn't allow them to do anything. And they're basically forced to hold in on the power button and restart their computer and hope they can get back into the quiz. So, again, it's one of those things where if you feel like it is adding some additional security, it is a feature that is available through Brightspace. But personally, I would just warn you of the downsides, and that is the access to the accessibility feature. So Rebecca asked, if you set up WebEx at the same time, this would not potentially cause students who have less bandwidth availability to lose the quiz and have to restart. So Rebecca, my suggestion was for you to create a WebEx session and make it optional for students to sign in. So if a student has low bandwidth and they don't want to risk signing in, they certainly don't have to. As well, if you're just logged into WebEx with no video being shared, no screen being shared, it's just audio, then there shouldn't be any bandwidth issues. That's a very low bandwidth draw. If you're going to have all your students sign in and turn on their webcams, then that is a huge draw on their bandwidth, and then navigating through their quiz could be affected. So just quickly, because we are at the end, I do want to show this new feature we have. You may notice one of the things I typically push a lot is the special access tool in quizzes, and that is when a student contacts the Blundin Center, and the Blundin Center gives them an accommodation of time and a half, double time, whatever the case may be, or they give them the accommodation to right click. You need to activate that in each individual quiz right now. So if you had a student in your class that gets time and a half, you need to come into every quiz and add special access for time and a half. So hopefully as of today, I know they're working on it, implementing it today. It's a new feature added to Brightspace called Accommodations. So if you go to your class list and you pick a student on this drop-down menu here that's always been here, you will now have a feature called Edit Accommodations. So if you look right now, it's likely not going to be there, but hopefully you'll see it by the end of the day. And by clicking Edit Accommodations, you get the ability to modify time limits for the entire course for that student. So this is something we've been screaming at Brightspace for a while. So I can say modify time limit. I can give them a set amount of extra minutes, or I can just put in a multiplier. So 1.5 times whatever I've given for each quiz. So now it doesn't matter if each quiz was different. It's just going to apply it by 1.5. And I can always allow right click. So these settings here, this time and a half, and this always allow right click is applicable for this student and this student only. So when they now go to their quiz page here, they're going to see time and a half for both of their quizzes. So the right click is a new feature. There was never a way to give single students the ability to right click. So that's something you can now do, and I think that's really important. And the ability to just give students time and a half for the entire course for that semester is also new. Basically, before now, you had to manually do that during special access inside of the quiz. So special access is still a feature, and there are still use cases for special access. So if a student wants to write at a different time, if you have a student who can't write at this time frame and you want to let them write later that day, special access is still what you want to use. And again, if you don't want to change your habits of changing the enforced time limit this way, you can still do it this way, and this in fact will override the accommodations tool. But it's now much easier to provide your students with time and a half for the entire semester. So that's a new feature that I should say, I don't know if we are really excited about it, but I am, because we know it's been a lot of work for courses that have a lot of quizzes, providing those settings on each individual quiz, if you have a lot of students, has been a big headache for some time. So this should be a new, a big help for those larger courses. Great, thanks for coming. So, we are at the end of the presentation. I'm sorry I did go a little bit long there, but I'm in no rush to get out of here. So any questions